In Britain as a whole, there are between about 270 and 290 different species of bee. We don't know the exact number because some species are very, very rare, literally sort of one record every decade. Other species are newly colonizing or newly recognized as species. So this number does fluctuate, but it's somewhere between 270 and 290, which is quite a lot more species than most people give bees credit for. Obviously, the honeybee is the bee, certainly as far as the media is concerned. Everything about bees tends to be illustrated with pictures of honeybees, but they are one species in almost 300. We, as an organisation, are the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, so we are primarily interested in the 24 bumblebee species that there are within Britain. Of those, 14 are in the species on the edge area, and we're going to talk about most of them today. Within the bumblebees, there's a split between the social species, of which there are 18 social species, and what we call the cuckoo bumblebees, of which there are 6, which are actually parasitic on those social species. And I'll talk a little bit more about the split and how that works later on. And all of the others are solitary bees. So nationwide, there are about 230 or so species. Again, that number does fluctuate because we are losing species and gaining species at the same time, but they come in a huge range of shapes and sizes and colours and life history strategies. They include things like the ivy bee, which doesn't even emerge from hibernation until August bank holiday weekend. We've got probably my favourite bee of all. This is ultimately a bicolour, which actually nests in snail shells and builds a little wigwam of sticks over the top of it. And they're fantastic little things. But we haven't got anywhere near enough time today to do them any kind of credit. So we're just going to talk about one solitary bee species that is particularly emblematic of the north coast of Scotland in today's session, which is the northern Colletes. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about how to identify that one later. And the reason that we exist as a charity and the reason why we are concerned about bumblebees is that they really haven't had a good century. So the first real Bumblebee Bible came out in 1912, written by a guy called Sladen, who was based down in the southeast of England, down in Kent. And he used to find all sorts of species everywhere, all the time, in big numbers. Around about the middle of the 20th century, 1950s, 60s, 70s, people started to realise that what they were finding, going out looking for bumblebees, even in the same areas that Sladen had been looking in the 1880s, 1890s, really wasn't matching. There weren't the species to be found, there wasn't the abundance of species to be found. And so in 1977, the first distribution atlas of bumblebees was commissioned. That was published in 1980, and it found really, really widespread declines. It looked mostly at the social bumblebees, and 7 of the then 20 social species of bumblebee that we had in Britain had declined by more than 70% in that 80-year period between 1900 and 1980. Those are catastrophic levels of decline. Bearing in mind particularly that this is just the area occupied. So if in Sladen's day there were hundreds or thousands of individuals at a site, and in 1980 there was one individual seen, that still counts as present. That wasn't showing as a decline. So it's only those areas that the species had disappeared from that showed up in that decline. So that 70% is, to be honest, quite an underestimation. And we actually lost 2 species in Britain during the 20th century. Bombus cullomanus, Cullen's bumblebee, was last seen on the Berkshire Downs in 1941, just south of Oxford. That is a species which was described new to science in Britain. It is scientifically 100% a British species, but it's not found here anymore. And then shortly after that atlas came out, we had the last known sighting of a wild British short-haired bumblebee, Bombus subterraneus, last seen at Dungeness in 1988. There was a multiple-year reintroduction effort led by the Trust along with partners Hymettus and Natural England and the RSPB. As far as we're aware, that reintroduction has failed and that species is still extinct in Britain. So a lot of our species are now so rare that at least one of the governments that make up the UK have put it on their individual endangered species lists. So in Wales, there are 5 species: the moss carder bumblebee, brown-banded carder, red-shanked carder, shrill carder, and ruderal bumblebee. England has all of those 5 listed, plus a 6th that reintroduced the population of the short-haired bumblebee. Scotland, many of those species don't occur in there, but it has some of them, plus the great yellow bumblebee, on which more later, and the bilberry bumblebee. And then the Northern Irish government adds another 4 species: Barbott's cuckoo, field cuckoo, red-tailed cuckoo, and the Heath bumblebee. And it again has some of the other species as well. So across the UK, half of our bumblebee species are so rare that at least one of the governments thinks that they are going to go extinct unless we do something about it, which is a really, really worryingly high proportion. And the poster child for these kind of declines is this species, which is iconic in the Species on the Edge project area. This is the great yellow bumblebee, and this is data hot off the press. This is literally straight from the NBN Atlas on Friday. This is the known distribution, or recorded distribution, in the first half of the 20th century. And you can see it's up on Orkney, it's up on the north coast of Scotland, it's in the Hebrides, but it's also all over the rest of England and a few records in Wales as well. This is a fairly widespread bumblebee at this stage. It's possibly never going to be the most common, but it is pretty widespread. If we fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, 1950 to 1999, you can see it is just winking out all over England, all over Wales. Massively increased survey effort, because obviously in the first 50 years of the century, you had 2 world wars and the Great Depression to distract people slightly from surveying for bumblebees. Whereas in the second half of the 20th century, we had the launch of national recording schemes. The National Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society was launched in the 1970s. The National Biological Record Centre to collate all these kinds of biological records was founded in 1962. There's 20 years of surveying for biodiversity action plans and all the rest of it. There's a huge amount more survey effort, lots of people looking for this species all over the place. But all of that survey effort produced a handful of English records, a couple of Welsh records. And if we look at the 21st century, it's gone. It is extinct in England, it is extinct in Wales. It's only now found right up in the Outer Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides, north coast of Scotland itself, and all over the Orkneys. So it's doing okay up there. There's good numbers, but there is an awful lot of people looking for it, through Katie in particular, and it's not found anywhere else. This is a species which has massively, catastrophically contracted its range size. So, Jackie, if you're not getting slides, you might need to go out and come in again. So next steps, knowing a little bit more about bumblebees, because historic declines, we can't change what happened in the 1930s, we can't change Dig for Victory in the 1940s and that kind of thing. What we need to know is what we can do about those declines now. And for that, we need to know a little bit more about what's happening now. And we can do a certain amount of that with historic data, but a lot of the common species are just listed as everywhere, if they're bothered to record at all, which makes it very difficult to tell if they're actually declining or not, because you can't plug that into a statistical model. We do have reasonable distribution records, particularly for those rarer species, so we do have a reasonable idea where the bees are, or at least where they were. So for things like the great yellow, we can pull those maps out and we can look at that range change. But what we don't know very much about is abundance. And that's true both for the rare species and for the common species. But abundance is really useful. Abundance tells us what's happening now. So you can imagine, as I alluded to earlier, if you go out to a site one year and you see hundreds or thousands of individuals of that species, and you go out the next year and you're see maybe half the number, and you go out the next year and you're down to tens, you go out the year after that and you're seeing 1 or 2 every visit, and you go out the year after that and you see 1 every 3 or 4 visits, you can tell that that population is in trouble. You can tell that that population is declining, even though on a distribution map, it would just show a dot each year. It would show completely standard distribution, unchanging, but abundance shows you this really disturbing trend of decline. So knowing about abundance gives us early warning of what's happening to those populations. It gives us a much better understanding of which are the species that are in trouble before it's too late. It takes a huge amount of time and effort and money and luck, frankly, to put something back once it's gone. If you've got the species there to work with, you've got a much better chance of being able to maintain and restore those populations. So knowing about abundance really helps us guide what we need to be doing, where and when. And that was recognised very early on in the story of the Trust. And so in 2008, the 8th of August to be precise, we had the first records come into our new recording scheme, Bee Walk. And this is designed, it's based very closely on the UK butterfly monitoring scheme, for those of you who come across that. And it's designed to have volunteers going out and walking a fixed route, a transect, each month between March and October. We suggest it's about a mile long, but it's really flexible and down to you as to what's feasible. And the idea is that we have the volunteers going out, recording the bees that they see, identifying them down to species as far as possible, though unknown bumblebee is always an option, and ideally down to caste as well, because knowing whether it's a queen or a male or a worker tells us a little bit more about that population. And that's why we run these kind of courses, and that's all stuff that I'm going to go through over the next hour and 3/4. Because this is the only national scheme for abundance of a major pollinator group. This is the only way that we have of detecting those kind of population level declines over time, and therefore the only way of getting that kind of early warning of potential losses, of which species need our help now and where do they need it, as opposed to which are the species that we should have been helping 80 years ago. The main aims for Bee Walk are to gather both abundance and distribution data for the UK's bumblebee species, to analyse that data and to report trends in those kind of bumblebee populations over time, and to really drill down a little bit further and look at what might be the causes of those changing trends, so climate change, habitat change, and also hopefully to assess things like the impact of habitat work, of conservation work that we're doing, because obviously trends can go up as well as down, and we can look at them at a regional level where we have and haven't been doing work and that kind of thing. So guidelines in terms of setting up a transect, we want the transect network to be representative of the country as a whole. So we aren't particularly prescriptive about where you go out and set it up. It can just be down your local road, around the local park, across a local footpath or whatever. Basically, it just needs to be one that you can commit to walking on that monthly basis, 8 times a year. So it needs to be somewhere which is convenient and accessible to you. As I say, we suggest that it's about a mile long, 1 to 2 kilometres, because in midsummer, when you're looking at bees and you're identifying them and recording them, that kind of thing, that mile walk will take about an hour. So we don't want people to overcommit and find that they're trying to walk a 10-mile walk or something and they're out there all day, because that's just not feasible. So a little bit of expectation management at the outset is always worthwhile. And it should be split into sections based on the habitat that you're walking through. So ideally, at least sort of 3 sections. But basically, the habitat affects the bees that you are likely to see and the time of year that you are likely to see it. So this is the hills I live on. So basically, if you were to walk along the ridgeline all the way up here, this could all be one transect. But this would be one section, because this is a nice open heathy grassland habitat. Then as you drop down, you go into the woods here. That's a very different habitat. You're going to get a different mix of bees at different times of year. So that would be a second section. And then as you climb out of the trees again up here, you're back into this open habitat grassland mix. That will be a third section, because you're back into a different habitat. So the trees, you're likely to see bees early in the year. These open habitats flower later. So it gives us an idea of why you're seeing the different species at the different times of year, different abundances at different times of year. And it lets us do analysis on what's happening in each habitat rather than just regionally. Guidelines for when you're actually out walking that transect are basically around standardization. The aim is that those walks are comparable each time and between years. So make sure that you walk the same transect each time. Don't veer off and go and stand next to this big patch of flowers that wasn't there a month ago, because it just confuses the data. Do try and walk the transect at least once a month during the main flight period of March to October. It's not the end of the world if you can't make it out in 1 month, but obviously we can't resurrect that data, we can't invent that data. So if you can walk as frequently as possible, then that's ideal. And you only really need to survey when weather conditions are suitable for bumblebee activity. Now, those of you who might have done the UK butterfly monitoring scheme will be familiar with their entire paragraph on how to define when weather conditions are suitable for butterflies. I think the air temperature has to be above 10 degrees Celsius, unless the sun is so bright and clear that you can see your shadow with sharp edges, in which case you can go up to about 13 degrees. And that's only as long as the wind isn't above a certain strength. So as long as the tree branches aren't moving more than the prescribed amount. And all of that is basically because compared to bumblebees, butterflies are wusses. Our equivalent thing for bumblebees is that if you can look out of the window and you wouldn't mind going out, it's not teeming with rain, it's not hailing, it's not snowing at that precise moment, there will be bumblebees out there. Bumblebees are pretty resilient to air temperatures. We know that they'll come out of hibernation in January, February sort of time, and they're quite happy to fly in those really cold temperatures. Having said that, obviously you get more when it's nicer weather. So generally, as long as it's reasonable weather, it's mildly warm, it's not too windy, it's not currently raining, then you should be okay. We generally suggest between about 10, 11 a.m. and 5 p.m, but that's really not hard and fast because they'll be out from dawn till dusk. And just take that into account, at the start of each survey, do make sure that you just fill in the environmental details on the recording form, which is just, is it sunny and cloudy, or cloudy? What's the rough temperature? And a couple of other bits and pieces which are explained on the form. It's fairly straightforward. Once you're actually out walking on that transect, again, standardization, try and walk at the same pace all the way around. It's always really tempting to sort of power walk across the car park where you never see anything, and then walk really slowly in that big patch where normally you see loads of bumblebees. But again, you just bias the data slightly that way. So do try and walk at a fairly steady pace as you go around. You can stop. If you see a whole load of bees, you can stop and you can just sort of count them, you can identify them, but you don't count any more that turn up during that time. So if you're stopped, the counting stops, basically. And again, to standardize between habitats and between recorders and everything else, and between bumblebee species, we only record within what we call the recording box, which is 4 meters wide, with you in the middle at the back of it, up to 4 meters in front of you, and from ground level up to 2 meters up, so just over head height for most people. And the reason why we do that is because different species can be identified at different ranges. Some of the species, like the tree bumblebee, are very, very distinctive. You could see it 10 yards away and know instantly that that's what it was. So you get an artificially high count of that species over things that need a little bit more of a closer look. Different people can identify bees at different ranges. So I've been doing this job for 12 years now. I would probably be able to see more bumblebees, be able to identify more bumblebees than someone who's just getting started in this. So my count would be higher, but having it just within that box minimizes that difference. And different habitats, you can just see different distances. So if you're walking through a woodland or through an urban area, you're not likely to be able to see much further than that box anyway. Whereas if you're in an open, flat dune system or a meadow, you could see for hundreds of meters potentially in all directions, and so you would get a much higher count in those habitats. So again, just restricting it to that recording box is quite important in terms of minimizing the differences between all those different confusing factors. And then once you see a bee, record it as far as possible down to species, but only if you're comfortable with that ID. As I say, we have unknown bumblebee as an option, and if you just aren't sure, if you think it's one of the ginger bumblebees or it had a red tail but I don't know which one, put it down as unknown bumblebee, put a note in the comments field about the group that you think it was in. Count how many individuals of each species, and count how many of each caste you have as well. So whether it's a queen, a male, or a worker. We have unknown caste as an option as well. So if you aren't sure, put it down as that. But if you can tell, if you can tell that it was a male because they're quite different in that species, or because it was massive, so it was a queen, then do put that information in, because again, that helps us understand what's happening with the populations. Yeah, unknown bumblebee of unknown caste is still a useful record as far as we're concerned, because it still tells us that there was a bumblebee there at that time on that date, and it feeds into the total bumblebee trends, and that's still useful information, and it's practice as well. And also do count honeybees as you go around. You can do solitary bees if you're particularly confident, but we don't make that as a request of people. But please do count honeybees when you see them, because we're really interested in how honeybees and bumblebees coincide and compete or work together or whatever. But the two golden rules really that consistency. So the same transect route each time, roughly the same pace as you go around, all the rest of it. And do send us the data. I know for a fact, unfortunately, there are people who do the fun bit and they never quite get around to actually putting the data into the website. But obviously, we can't do anything with it until it's on the website. And the website is down at the bottom here, bwalk.org.uk. But if you search bwalk, it should come up as well. Obviously, that is a bit of an ask. There is a bit more of a protocol than perhaps might be normal there. Bees can be a little bit tricky to ID. So we have tried to meet you halfway as far as possible. We have a whole load of resources on the Bee Walk website on identification and how to do bee walks and that kind of thing. It's text documents, PDFs on there, but there are also videos which are linked from the Bee Walk website, and they're also on YouTube. We're in the process of doing a massive update on that and having proper online training, which will hopefully be online next month. And we also have our surveys officer, Helen, who's around 3 days a week at the end of this email and will be able to help you with all Bee Walk related things, including identification. She also runs a selection of monthly online guidance and support sessions and refresher sessions and all the rest of it. So if you're interested in any of those, do get in contact with her on that email and she'll be able to sort you out. And Bee Walk in general has grown really quite impressively from one transect in 2008 to 984 in 2024. And we've got over 1 million individual bumblebees recorded in there, 1/3 of a million records. It's a massively useful data set now where we can really get our teeth into what's actually happening with bumblebees. Some of you may have seen the reporting that came out recently about the impact of weather and on bumblebee populations last year and what happened to our bumblebees. And we can calculate that. We can look at 2024, this red line here, and we can compare that to all of our previous years. So each of these years from 2010 onwards is one of these grey lines. And you can see they all show the same kind of basic pattern, but 2024 was really, really poor June and then onwards. Everything else normally increases in June. They didn't last year because the weather stopped an awful lot of nests being established. And overall, if you combine all of those previous years into this average, this red dotted line here is what you would expect bees to be doing. The blue line is what actually happened in 2024. And you can see straight away where the problem was. It was the weather in late May and then June causing this massive drop off. And so, right the wrong way there. Overall, we can see that this is the annual number. This is how many sort of bees you'd expect to see each year. We can see this big drop off in 2024 compared to 23. It was actually the worst year that we've had on record. And we were missing 22.5% of our bees. So almost 1/4 of our bumblebees were missing last year, essentially, which is obviously not really what we want to see. And some species had a really, really bad year. The white-tailed bumblebee was down 60% over its normal levels. You can see it just started badly and then got worse from there. The red-tailed bumblebee was actually down 74%. 3 in every 4 red-tailed bumblebees that you would expect to see just weren't there last year. And this is a warmth-loving species. It fades out as you get further north through Scotland anyway, so it was particularly hard hit by the really cold, wet, horrible spring and early summer that we had last year. You can see it started okay. March was normal numbers, but then it just faded out and never really got properly going. So it had a really bad year. And quite a lot of our species did quite badly, but it was also a really quite mixed picture nationwide. And there are several species which actually did badly in England, but quite well in Wales. This is brown-banded carder. The tree bumblebee here actually did really quite well in Scotland. This line across here is 100%. That's where the species had its average numbers. And you can see it did almost twice as well in Scotland as you would normally expect it to, but only about half as well in England and Wales for the tree bumblebee. Tree bumblebee is colonising its way up Scotland as it is. The heath bumblebee here really liked last year. It lives mostly in fairly mountainous moorland areas, and so cold, wet weather is quite good for it, as it turns out. And it did particularly well in Wales, but pretty well also in Scotland and in England. Other species, again, did okay in one or two of the countries, but worse in another. So it was quite a mixed bag because we didn't have the same weather everywhere, and because bees differ in their responses to those different conditions. But overall, it was a pretty poor year for pretty much everything with wings last year. So bee walk obviously is the gold standard essentially, but it's quite a commitment. Great Yellow is here, and obviously he's only in Scotland, and it seemed to do quite well, but don't put too much weight on that because it is based on very, very few records, both last year and historically before that. So because we're only just really getting decent numbers of transects within its range through the Species on the Edge project, which is great to see. This is the first year we'd have been able to do any kind of statistics on the Great Yellow. But yeah, that's based on about 20 records across that 15-year period. So you can't put too much weight on averages and that kind of thing at that point. But certainly it's far better to see them above that red line than below it. But yeah, if bee walk is a bit much, or if you just want a chance to practice or whatever, then there's also the flower insect time count, fit count methodology, which is part of the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, or POMS. And this is designed to be a much more sort of lightweight experiment. The basic idea is that you find the little patch of flowers, which sits within a 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre square, as we've got here. And you sit next to it for 10 minutes in the sunshine and see what turns up at a really broad group level. So you're not having to identify anything down to species. You're just looking for how many bumblebees, how many butterflies, how many beetles, that sort of thing. And do that for 10 minutes, see what turns up, see what lands, visits the flower, and then put that data into the POMS website or Fit Counts app. And it's done. And that lets us essentially benchmark how all of these other pollinator groups, because there are anywhere between 2 and 20,000 pollinator species in Britain. And whilst we've got good, accurate numbers for bumblebees and for butterflies through Bee Walk and the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, we don't have, and we're never likely to have that for most of those other pollinators, because that's just an approach which is really difficult to do for them. So having the data coming in from fit counts lets us benchmark how all of the hairy flies and that kind of thing are doing compared to bumblebees and butterflies, where we know exactly how they're doing. So it's designed to be quick and simple and easy, and you can do it in your garden at lunchtime, or you can do it with a school group or on a BioBlitz or whatever. But it's also contributing valuable scientific data as well, and it really is useful. If you are open to a little bit more of a challenge, then the other side of the National UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme is this 1 kilometre square survey, which involves a semi-randomly selected 1 kilometre grid square. So you can see you've got 4 up in the species up or near it, the species on the edge area, and there are 95 across the UK. And the idea is to get an idea of how pollinators in the broad sense are doing in agricultural areas and in semi-natural areas. And so most of these squares are co-located with other monitoring sites. So there are various sites across the country where we monitor air quality, where we monitor the biodiversity, which might be part of agri-environment scheme monitoring and that kind of thing. And so we've added pollinator monitoring to those 1 kilometre grid squares, essentially. And it involves 4 visits per year in May, June, July and August. Pan trapping and doing fit counts, possibly this year some transects as well, but we're still working on that. And the pan trap samples all go down to the NHM down in London to be identified by genetic means if necessary and that kind of thing. And it gives us a really good understanding of how pollinators are doing in that area. So these red and orange ones are available. If anyone were in a position to be able to go out and do those surveys, it would be fantastic to get the north coast of Scotland added to the scheme, because you can see we've got a few down in the south of Scotland, but we're really lacking up in the north coast of Scotland. It's a very, very different habitat. There's lots of different species up there. It would be great to get some of those gaps filled in, if at all possible. If you are interested, drop Katie or myself an email or go directly to POMS via the feedback form. And Martin would love to hear from you, I'm sure. But Obviously, monitoring of any kind needs identification to at least some level. Bumblebees, that can be a little bit tricky because they do vary quite a lot between the casts. Males in particular often look quite different to queens or to workers. So we get into this little loop of what caste is it and what species is it. But in the main sense, bumblebees stand out as a group quite well. You can normally be pretty happy that you are looking at a bumblebee and not something else because they are furry all over. They are this characteristic flying barrel kind of shape. With the best will in the world, they aren't smooth and sleek and aerodynamic. They are the articulated lorries of the insect world. Because of that, they produce quite a loud but quite a low-pitched buzzing noise as they fly around. You can often hear them before you see them. And in females, which are the majority of the bees that you will see, then they have pollen baskets on the hind legs, and quite often, as we have here, they are full of pollen, and that stands out, and only honeybees and bumblebees actually carry the pollen in a big blob on the hind leg like this, so it's quite distinctive. But obviously they're not always carrying pollen, so sometimes those pollen baskets are empty. One thing that is important to point out is that the stripes, all of the colours that you can see here, the yellow stripes here, the red on the tail, the black everywhere else, all of those colours, all of those identification features are only on the hair. If you were to shave a bumblebee, please don't shave bumblebees, it would look like this, where it's completely black and shiny all over, and as well as being quite angry, it's almost impossible to identify because you've just lost all of those distinguishing features. I should probably point out that this one wasn't shaved. It was a bumblebee which strayed into a honeybee hive, and they got a bit annoyed by this and they pulled all its hair out, and this was found by a friend of mine lurking at the bottom of the hive. So they are very, very difficult to identify once they start getting worn. There aren't people out there shaving them as far as I'm aware, but you do sometimes find them at this kind of level of wear, and as they have quite a hard life, they spend their life flying around, constantly bumping into bits of vegetation, particularly in wet weather, they will lose their hairs. And so you get great big bald patches where there ought to be stripes, and it does get a little bit tricky once they are on the elderly side, because all of those stripes, as I say, are in the hair, not the exoskeleton. And there are also an awful lot of things out there which really want you to think that they are bumblebees. So there are various hoverflies and other things which are directly mimicking either honeybees, as we've got here, or bumblebees, and sometimes those mimics can be really quite impressive. Others, we've got species which, through a process of convergent evolution, have come out looking broadly similar. So this is Tachina oscina, the bear fly, which flies in March and April. So it's big and fat and round and hairy in order to keep warm, the same reason that bumblebees are big and fat and round and hairy. And we get records of this sent in every year as a bumblebee. And sometimes it's slightly more nefarious. This is a bee fly in the middle here, Bombilius major, and it basically cosplays as a generic bee because it is parasitic in the nest of solitary mining bees. So it looks fairly bee-like in order to be able to sneak up to the nesting burrows of various species of solitary bee and drop its eggs down the nest hole when the parents aren't looking. And if it stood out, they will be able to chase it off very easily. But because it blends in by looking quite bee-like, it can get away with it. So there's a whole load of reasons why there's a lot of things out there that look quite bee-like. But the end result is that you have the 24 bumblebee species and 60 to 100 other non-bumblebee things which look quite similar. And sometimes that mimicry can be really quite impressive. Here we have the bumblebee on the left and a hoverfly pretending to be a bee on the right. And you can see it's got the same kind of patterns, the same kind of pose. At a glance, it would be very easy to be taken in by that. And if you ask a taxonomist how to split a bee from a fly, then they will tell you that a fly, Diptera, 2 wings, a bee has got 4 wings. Unfortunately, when it's flapping those wings 2,500 times a minute, it's very, very difficult to see exactly how many wings it actually has. So the best way to get started with it, in particular, is to look at the head. Flies are very, very visual first creatures, essentially. And so the eyes make up almost the entirety of the head. As you can see here, there's very little head here that isn't eye. Bumblebees, they're quite visual, but they're also quite heavily reliant on their antennae. So the eyes are visible, they're there, but they're a much smaller proportion of the head overall. Bumblebees always have these long, obvious tubular antennae as well. You can see them up here, whereas flies generally have these funny little stumpy antennae that we've got here with bristles on. And bumblebees also have these great long tubular mouth parts, which normally they're folded up underneath the bee when it's flying, but as here, when it's about to start feeding, it rolls its tongue out and sticks it out in front of it, as we've got here. Virtually all of the flies that look like bumblebees don't have that. They just have these funny little stumpy mouth parts under here. They can't extend a great long tube like the bee does here. And as you get your eye in a bit more, as you pick things up, then you will start to appreciate more differences in the way that they behave and the way that they fly and the body shape. You can see the abdomen is a very different shape here, but those are quite subtle. The best way to start definitely is to look at the head. Now, size is not very useful for bumblebees. Normally, obviously, size is really important. You know, if you've got a mystery bird on your bird feeder and it's got a 2-meter wingspan, you can be pretty happy it's not going to be a blue tip. But size doesn't work that way in bumblebees. Size in bumblebees is much more about what caste you've got than what species. Some species tend to be a bit bigger, tend to be a bit smaller, but even the biggest species and the smallest species in Britain overlap a lot in the middle. So queens are the biggest caste, and up here we've got a queen and her daughter workers. You can see she's much, much bigger than they are, even though they are as closely related as you can be, let alone the same species. They are direct relations. Down here we've got a male, which you can see it certainly thinks it's the same species as that queen, but it's about a third of the size. So size can be quite useful in telling what caste you've got. And if you know what caste you've got, it might be a little bit of help with the species, but generally it's not much use with species because size also varies with nutrition. You get really, really small workers at the start of the season going up to bigger, even from the same nest. It just depends how much food they've got to go around. So generally in Britain, we talk about the big 8 common and widespread bumblebee species. In species on the edge area, we don't have one of those quite yet. We don't have the tree bumblebee. So we're just down to the big 7. We've got a couple of red-tail species, a couple of white-tail species, and one all-ginger species that are common and widespread nationwide. The exact status in the project area is actually slightly different. Things like the red-tailed bumblebee are quite scarce by comparison, but these are the species which are everywhere. And they are habitat generalists as well. So yeah, generally nationwide we talk about this as a grouping. Luckily in the species on the edge area we can knock out some of those species and we're left with these one common ginger bee, couple of scarce or rare ginger or yellow bees, a couple of common red tails, a couple of slightly scarcer red tails, and as you can see we've still got quite a lot of white-tailed bumblebees, so they are still going to be the biggest challenge, but we'll talk through those. Down at the bottom here, we've got cuckoo bumblebees. Those are parasitic species that I mentioned earlier. There are 6 nationwide, but only 2 in the far north of Scotland. And these are a really interesting group. They actually evolved from the social bumblebees, but they looked at a lifestyle that involved working hard dawn till dusk for 3 months of the year, going out collecting pollen, collecting nectar, bringing it back to the nest, and thought, that looks a bit like hard work. So instead, what these guys do is they started off just waiting for a different bee of the same or related species to set up a nest, and then the queen came in and took over that nest. And gradually that behaviour got more and more ingrained until now they are obligate nest thieves like cuckoo birds, hence their name. And so what these do now is each of our 6 species has a preferred host species. They come out from hibernation 4 to 6 weeks or so after their preferred host species, so you don't see them much before Easter, even in the south of England. And they sit around on flowers, nectaring, building themselves up, and waiting for one of their preferred host species queens to fly by, carrying pollen back to a nest. The cuckoo will then trail her back to that nest and spend a bit of time just hanging around the outskirts of that nest, picking up the scent of it. Because most bumblebee nests are underground, or at least dark, then the communication in them is chemical. They need to smell right to be able to come in. And after that little bit of acclimation time, They will wait for the exact moment, ideally when there's just the queen in that nest and there are a few workers, but they're all out foraging. And the queen cuckoo will come in and will basically fight a duel for control of that nest with the host queen, the queen who set that nest up. The cuckoos tend to have a longer sting and a thicker exoskeleton, so they've got better armor, they've got better weaponry. They tend to win those duels, particularly when they're just one-on-one against the queen. And so they will sting that host queen to death. She will then go on a bit of a rampage across the brood comb. She will kill, possibly even eat, any recently laid eggs or any really young larvae, because they're going to be competition. What she wants to do then is to splurge out a whole load of eggs. One of their other adaptations is to have ovaries 3 times the size of a normal bumblebee, so they can lay up to about 3 dozen eggs at a time. And then she'll go. That's the extent of her parental care. Those eggs will hatch into larvae. The workers in that nest don't really know what's gone on, but they are just programmed to feed developing larvae, to look after those larvae. And so that's what they will keep doing. Any large larvae which the cuckoo queen left will pupate and turn into workers in due course. And that nest will stagger on just long enough to raise a brood of cuckoo bumblebees. Another 6 or 8 weeks after the host queen was killed, after the cuckoo took it over, then that nest will produce a burst of a couple of dozen new cuckoo bumblebees. But there's no more eggs being laid, there's no more larvae coming through, there's no more workers, there's no more reproductives, and so that nest will at that point fade out and die. Basically, it's a zombie nest that just staggers on just long enough to raise those cuckoos. Yeah, cuckoos don't have a worker calf because the foraging is done by the workers of the nest that they've taken over. So we still call them queens because they are reproductive female bumblebees, but you don't have a worker calf in cuckoo bumblebees. So perhaps appropriately, they have a fairly dark and sinister appearance. Females of most species only have this yellow band near the head and then black down to the colour of the tail. Don't have pollen baskets because they don't do foraging at all, except a bit of nectar for themselves. And most of the species have darkened wing membranes. So all the species have dark veins, but cuckoos tend to have quite dark brown wing membranes between those veins. And most of the species have this notch, this sort of V or a flat-bottomed U in the top of the tail, where the colour of the tail extends further up the sides than it does at the top. So that combination of features, dark wings, hairy legs, notch in the top of the tail, is often the best way to pick out the fact that you've got a cuckoo. There's a few others. They have sparser hairs, but you can see a lot of the exoskeleton coming through here because they're not foraging dawn till dusk. They're not coming out in the early spring. They don't need to be as warm. And they're all short-tongued species as well. So yeah, nationwide we've got 6 species. In species on the edge area, we've only got these 2, gypsy cuckoo, Bombus bohemicus, and Barbett's cuckoo, Bombus barbatellus, which makes life a little bit easier because these are comparatively straightforward to tell apart than some of the others. But we'll talk about those a little bit later. I mentioned solitary bees right back at the start. There is one species that we're going to talk about today, and this is the northern Colletes, Colletes floralis, which, as you can see, is really coastal and in Britain, in particular, is really found in good numbers up on the Outer Hebrides, slightly smaller numbers in the Inner Hebrides, and then this one England population, this one England population, plus a little bit on the mainland of Scotland here. But this is, we've got a real hotspot in the project area. And this is one of just 2 Colletes. It's the size of a small honeybee, 8 to 10 millimeters long. And in particular, it's got this really obviously striped abdomen, black and white striped abdomen, and this really sort of foxy ginger brown thorax. So it's relatively straightforward to pick out as one of 2 species. Flies midsummer, mid-June through to August. There is one confusion species. As I say, there are 2 Colletes species found on the Outer Hebrides. Colletes floralis is the one that we're particularly interested in. It is a maca specialist. It's mostly on the dunes, flies June to August, so it's a little bit of a different habitat to the other Colletes, which is the heather Colletes, Colletes succinctus, which is a heath specialist, but it does really like dune heath, so where you've got the maca fading into heath, you've potentially got both flying side by side. Flies a little bit later, July into September, but of course there's a lot of overlap. July and August, you've got both on the wing. Males are really, really difficult to ID and are basically best done by microscopy. But the females you can do. So the key thing to look at is T1, section 1 of the abdomen, which is this bit here, where we've got the arrow. In Floralis, the one that we're interested in, you've got a little bit of sparse hair along here. In Succinctus, the one that we're not interested in, you've got these big, obvious triangular wedges of hairs here. Succinctus also has this quite obvious orange back to that first section. It's not there in Floralis. And Floralis has a really smooth, polished surface to that section. You can see the light reflecting off it with just these dimples within it. In Succinctus, it looks as if it's been sanded. It's slightly dull and glazed all over. You're not getting the same reflection back off it. It's still got those dimples in there, but it's dull and not anywhere near as reflective as you've got in Floralis. So if you can check that and you can see that in the field, particularly with a hand lens, then you're safe to say that you've got Floralis, but it's very much worth putting in the notes when you put that record in as to how you actually identified it, because they are really quite similar and because Floralis is a very important record. So we've got a little bit of time for questions now before we go for a quick break. I'll just have a quick look in the chat, but if you have a question, if you want to put your hand up, virtual hand. I think we've covered all of the questions in the chat. If there are any more, or whether we can just go for a break. That sounds like it's time for a break now. So, there's one in chat. Carola, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hello, yes. I live on the northwest coast of the Isle of Lewis.
Lovely.
I've never done a bee walk, but I've walked up and down my croft for 50 years and certainly noticed the decline in the great yellow bumblebee. But in recent years, the real decline seems to be in the moscardas, which we used to get a lot of in the garden, particularly in the polytunnel, which they really liked. And that seems to me to be really dramatic in the past 3-4 years. Can you tell me anything about that?
Moscarda is one of the species that we are most worried about because it's the only real species that's combined that historic distribution decline. It hollowed out its range across most of the country, and it's still declining in those areas. Species like the great yellow, like the Shrilcarda, which have undergone a much greater distribution decline, they're now stable, more or less stable in those populations. The Moscarda isn't. It still seems to be declining, and while we don't have enough data to say anything particularly from the Outer Hebrides for it, it's a species which is really, really struggling nationwide at the moment. Unfortunately, we are seeing ongoing both abundance and distribution declines for that species. So it's concerning. It is a species which is one of our priorities for the Species on the Edge project for precisely that reason. And obviously the Agricolae form that you get up there is fantastic. It's probably the prettiest bumblebee that we've got in Britain, but unfortunately it's really struggling at the moment.
Thanks. Well, I'm very sad to hear that because I've enjoyed them for many years.
We know that it does do well where the habitat is there, and if you go down to South Uist on the Maca, it's all over the place, but there's not very much of that habitat left, and not enough of that habitat left to sustain those populations, unfortunately. So on that happy note, unless there are any more questions, we'll go for a quick break and aim to be back at 11, if that's okay with people. We will see you then. So what we're going to cover now is identification, and we're going to work our way through the species which are those that you're actually going to come across just in the bumblebees, because we've done Colletes now. And we're going to break those down into the basic colour pattern groups to make life as easy as possible. So to start with, we're going to look at the ginger or uniform-tailed bees. Generally, the most abundant of these, certainly nationwide, is the common carder bumblebee, Bombus pascorum. It's a slightly different situation in the species on the edge area. It's not yet found on Shetland. It is on Orkney, though it's only been there since it colonised in the 1980s. It's on the north coast, it's in the inner Hebrides, has been for quite a long time. And in the outer Hebrides, it is now there, but it's only colonised in the last decade or so. So it's not anywhere near as abundant in those newly colonised areas as it might be elsewhere. And this is generally fairly distinctive. It's this same pattern, whether it's queens, workers or males. It's gingerish all over, fading to cream as we go down the sides of the thorax, and with a mixture of ginger brown, black and cream hairs on the tail, which sometimes looks a little bit stripy like this, but is generally a mix of all three all the way down. It doesn't have a clear, distinct tail that's a different colour from the abdomen. It's a relatively variable species. It fades from being sort of bright lucozade orange at one end of the spectrum down to sort of dull biscuity beige colour at the other. But it does generally be a sort of uniform colour, whether that's bright orange, whether that's beige. It's uniform throughout and always has these black hairs on the abdomen. It doesn't tend to have forms where the top of the thorax is a very different colour to the abdomen. It sometimes does, but when it does, that's dark on the abdomen and really quite distinctive all over. And even there, you can still see that it's got this sort of ginger brown hair all the way down, just an awful lot of black hairs in there. What it doesn't do is what the muscard does, which is have a really bright ginger orange thorax and then a yellow abdomen. So the muscarda is the other ginger species that you will see. And you can see from this view, it's quite different colours on the abdomen compared to the thorax. It's always generally a brighter species, particularly in queens. Some of the workers do get a little bit of a dull brown sort of coloration, but generally the species is a little bit bigger than the common carder and a lot brighter. And in particular, it has this blonde sort of butter yellow colour abdomen with a bit of ginger at the front, and then this butter yellow halo around the thorax. Really, the sides are butter yellow rather than beigey cream. It has a little bit at the back here as well. So it's quite a distinctive species, even in this common colour form. And in particular, it never has any black hairs on the top. So it never has any black hairs on the abdomen, never has any black hairs around the wing bases or anything here. It's quite a bright orange and yellow species rather than being dull sort of brown all over. And you can see this is its most recent distribution. It used to be found all over everywhere, but it's really hollowed out its range in England, Wales and in Scotland as well, where it's pushed out to the coasts. And those are the only places that you are likely to find it nowadays. And this is all over the project area. On Orkney, on the north coast and in the inner Hebrides, it looks like this, where it's really quite pretty species, but quite close in appearance to the common carder. On the outer Hebrides and on Shetland, you get a different colour form agricolae, which is, as I say, a really, really pretty form. Yeah, those are the ID features again. So bright butter yellow abdomen, bright butter yellow sides to the thorax, this ginger stripe on the second abdominal section are key things. But form agricolae is a fantastic colour form. It's recognisable still as muscorum. It's only on, as I say, outer Hebrides and on the Orkneys. It's sometimes called the on the Shetlands, and on the outer Hebrides, it's sometimes called the Shetland bumblebee. But there's actually quite a lot more on the outer Hebrides. And it, from above, looks fairly similar. Again, we've got this butter yellow abdomen, quite a bright ginger orange thorax, but underneath it's jet black, and it tends to be really quite a bright, obvious species. And there's nothing else with that kind of patterning, which is nice. So that jet black underside, that bright yellow abdomen. You We do sometimes get records mistaking it for the great yellow, but this species never has black band between the wing bases. It always has just this totally orange top to the thorax. So it's a really, really distinctive subspecies. So across most of the country, you potentially have 3 ginger bumblebees. Luckily, up in the north of Scotland, you don't need to worry about the brown-banded carder, Bombus humilis, so that just leaves you with Bombus pascorum and Bombus muscorum. But although Agricolae is really straightforward to tell apart, the standard form of Bombus muscorum is often a lot trickier. So looking at those in a little bit more detail, this is the common carder. And the key thing is that although it's got this ginger brown cream appearance, it will always have some black hairs on the abdomen. Hopefully you can just about see that some of these hairs down here are black, some of the ones up here, but it shows that this is the worst possible angle to be looking at because you're trying to look for black hairs against a black background, and it's really quite difficult in many cases to see whether what you're looking for here, whether you're looking at here, sorry, is a black hair or a gap between ginger hairs that you can see the black background through. So sometimes they make life easy and it really doesn't matter, and you can see there's lots of black hairs, but generally you're at a much more an advantage if you're looking across. And so if you've got it against a pale background, in here it's because someone's holding it, but you can see this rim up here where you're looking through the pale hairs at a pale background. It's much easier to see whether there are any black hairs in here. In this case, this is the common form of muscorum. It doesn't have any black hairs on the thorax. It also doesn't have any at the front here around the wing bases. Basically, it doesn't have any black hairs on the upper surfaces. If we go back and look at pascorum, it's got black hairs in here. You can see some in here. You can see this one, for example, some here against a paler background. It also has some black hairs up here. You can see these darker hairs against the pale sides. They're never there anywhere in muscorum. So it's another species where you do potentially need to look quite closely, but bearing in mind that it's only really on the outer Hebrides, on the north coast of Scotland where you've got both, and on Orkney where you've got both the normal form of muscorum and pascorum as well, when you've got those 2 species flying side by side. In the Hebrides, you've got Agricolae, and in the Shetlands, you don't have pascorum. So muscorum doesn't have any black hairs up here either. You can see it's just got these ginger and yellow hairs. There are no black hairs in there at all. So this is often something that you'll need to see with a hand lens if you're really, this is quite a worn individual, so you'd need to double check. If you can see them with the naked eye, then that's fine. Often you can with pascorum, but where you aren't sure, possibly because it's muscorum, then you need to have a closer look. The other species in that group is the great yellow, and this is a really distinctive species. It's quite hard to mistake for much else, but we do get records from tourists who haven't seen either the island form of muscorum or Distinguendus, and so they send us dodgy records every year. The key thing is that this is this velvety golden yellow all over, apart from this big obvious black band between the wing bases. It's a big species, and there's not much else similar in size to it, so that combination, it's a big bright yellow thing with this black band, is pretty much unique in the British fauna. Bombus campestris sometimes gets close, but it doesn't overlap in range with the great yellow anymore, so it's not a species that you need to worry about. And yeah, males, workers, queens all have the same basic colour pattern. They're all very similar, apart from slightly different size and slightly different shagginess, but it's a really distinctive species. And please do send us any records of any sightings, photos, that kind of thing, because we're really interested in the species. It's one of the 2 most endangered species in Britain, bumblebee wise. It's not currently on Shetland. It did used to be, but it went extinct in about the 1920s, I think. It's found Orkney, North Coast, in the Hebrides, outer Hebrides, in varying numbers, but it's in all of those areas. The second group are the red-tailed bumblebees, and there are, as you can see, 4 of those. So we have the early bumblebee, This is a species which is just about reaching its northern range extent within the project area. It literally turned up on the Outer Hebrides for the first time last year. I think Katie found a couple of individuals. Shetland, it colonised in 2018. Orkney, it's probably colonising. There are records which sound right, but I don't think we've got any definitive proof. We haven't had anyone who has taken photos which we can look at and say definitively, this is definitely the early bumblebee. So if you do find any on Orkney, and we have had records on bee walks from Orkney, but unfortunately we haven't managed to prove definitively that it's there yet, but it probably is. And if you do see one in Orkney, do take as many pictures as you possibly can and send them to Katie or myself, or to anyone else in a position of authority. It's on the north coast, relatively small numbers, but growing, and it's in the Inner Hebrides and has been for a while, as you can see up here. And this is the only common species which has got a red tail and yellow bands in the queens and in the workers. So it's quite distinctive. It's quite an early, it's a spring flying species. And so I'm down in Worcestershire in England. I'd expect to see them starting to appear this month, ramping up into big numbers in May and June, and then disappearing. It'll be a little bit later up in the north of Scotland, but it's still that real spring specialist and disappears after midsummer. Males are really, really attractive things. These great big fluffy yellow bands, yellow extending down onto the face. Workers tend to lose this abdominal band, but queens always show it. And one of its distinguishing features is how rubbish the tail colour is. It's a really sort of washed out orange tail, but males are really, really distinctive. Queens are quite distinctive. Workers are a little bit trickier, but you can still see it's got this really washed out orangey tail. It's clearly not white, but it's not that bright fire engine red either, and that's quite a distinctive feature for the species. And it's quite a small species. It's noticeably smaller than most of the other queens and workers that you'll see. The other common red-tailed species is the red-tailed bumblebee. And again, this is a species where that status is slightly misleading in the Species on the Edge project area, where it is nowhere near as common as it is in the rest of the country. It is found on the north coast, but as you can see, not very much. It's found in the Inner Hebrides in small numbers. It's not found on Shetland. It went extinct in the 1930s on Orkney. 1938, I think, was the last record. And there are as yet no records on the Outer Hebrides. It's a warmth-loving species. It is spreading northwards, so it may well be that it starts to become a little bit more abundant, and it's worth looking out for. But after the really abysmal 2024 that it had, it was probably set back quite a long way, so I wouldn't expect many sightings this year. Females, whether they're queens or workers, have this really velvety jet black appearance with a big, bright sort of fire engine red tail, really distinctive looking species. There's not really much anything else that looks like it. The only one that does is the red shank carder, which I'll talk about shortly. This species always has black corbicular hairs. So these hairs on the leg around the pollen basket, which is the corbicula, are always black. But generally, if you see a jet black bumblebee with a big bright red tail, this should be what you're thinking of first and foremost. Males, you start getting big numbers from July onwards, and they spend an awful lot of time sitting on flowers. They like knapweed in particular, but they're not hugely fussy. You can see this one's on bramble, and they will spend an awful lot of time sitting there not doing very much. They have this big obvious bright tail as well, but they also have a yellow collar band, and that yellow extends forward down over the face. You can see it's got a yellow moustache here, and usually a little bit of yellow at the back of the thorax as well, in varying amounts. And you'll see quite a lot of those if they're around. And again, they're really nice, distinctive little thing. They do look a little bit similar to the early bumblebee males, but they normally don't particularly overlap. The early bumblebee males have more or less finished by the time the red-tailed males appear, because they're only produced at the end of those colony cycles. So yeah, looking at the front end, that yellow face in the male, looking for that big obvious bright red back end with no yellow bands in the female. Redshank carder is the only species really that you can confuse easily for the red-tailed bumblebee, and If you're on Col and Tiree, you've got a pretty good chance of seeing the species. If you're anywhere else, as you can see, it's about 200 miles to the nearest colony. So it's only really on those two islands. Why it's there, why it's doing so well there, we just don't know. It's weird, but it is there, and we do get good numbers of sightings from the bee walks and from the RSPB reserves up there. It's a species which has the same kind of general appearance as the female redtail. It's black all over with a red tail, but it's never the sort of bright jet black and big, bright fire engine red that you see in the redtail. It is black fading to dark brown, and it fades to dark brown quite quickly. It's almost the colour of dark chocolate most of the time when you see it. The orange in the tail is noticeably orange rather than red. You can see here it's nowhere near as bright as the last species. And so when you see them, they look different. They look slightly off, as if they've faded. And you can see the corbicular hairs, the hairs around the pollen basket here, are clearly orangey red and not black. That's only a feature in the females, because males of both species have reddish hairs there, but males of this species never have a yellow face. Male redtails always have a big yellow moustache. Males of this species don't. So if you've got a red-tailed male with a black face, you found something interesting and not just another Lapidarius. So yeah, those key features. Males have a little bit of dark yellow striping in there, but the key thing is that they have this black face. Females have this orange hair on the pollen basket, which you can see on here as well. And Bilberry bumblebee is a competitor for our prettiest bumblebee species, along with Muscarora agricolae. As you can see, it's a mainland species. It is on the Inner Hebrides. It does just about reach the north coast, but it's really a species of upland areas, of hill and mountain and moorland. So it's not a species that impinges very much on the project area, but you will just about come across it on the fringes. And it's a really nice species. The key thing is just how extensive the red on its tail is. You can see it's almost the entirety of the abdomen, coming all the way up here from the tip of the abdomen up to about the second abdominal section. It's this really nice, warm fire red. All the cast look fairly similar, but have varying strengths of the yellow markings. Males have more yellow on the face and more of a moustache than the females do, but the females will quite often have some yellow on the face as well. All of them have these yellow bands front and back of the thorax. Again, a little bit more extensive in the males than in the females, but they are fairly conserved. They all have more or less the same kind of appearance, and in particular that big, obvious, bright red back end. And if you're up a mountain, you're on moorland, this is a species that you should expect to be seeing. But if you're in the dunes or you're down at sea level, probably not. It's not on any of the island groups. So a little bit of a quick quiz. So we're not going to pick on people, but I'll show a picture, I will read out a couple of options, and if you put your virtual hands up, or your real life hands if you prefer, when I say the one that you think it is, then we'll just get a brief idea of where people think we are. So here is our first picture. Hands up if you think that this is a common carder bumblebee. Got a few hands going up there. See 7, 8, 10. Okay, so that's about a quarter of us. Hands up if you think that this is a moss carder of either colour form. A few hands going down, a few different ones going up, slightly fewer. Hands up if you think that this is a red-tailed bumblebee. A few hands staying up. I don't think any more went up. Yeah, this is a common carder bumblebee. In this case, you can see it's got quite a lot of black hair on the abdomen here. Got a little bit of black hair as well here. Obviously it doesn't have a red tail or anything. It's clearly one of those ginger species, but it's got obvious black hairs on the upper surfaces, so it has to be a common carder. What about this one? Who thinks that this might be a red-chanked carder? Got a few hands up, but I think they're legacy hands. No new ones going up. Who thinks that this might be a bilberry bumblebee? Got a few hands. Who thinks that this might be a red-tailed bumblebee? A lot of hands going up. That's good, because this is indeed a queen red-tailed bumblebee. So jet black all over, no yellow stripes or anything, big, obvious, bright red tail. And you can see the pollen basket. You can see that these hairs fringing it are clearly black and not any other colour. So this is a red-tailed bumblebee. And what about this one? Who thinks that this might be a bilberry bumblebee? Few hands going up there. Who thinks that this might be a red-tailed bumblebee? Change in the hands. And who thinks that this might be an early bumblebee? Yeah, many more hands going up. That's great, because this is a queen early bumblebee. So we've got a fairly small, fairly orangey tail. Then these two yellow bands. Basically, that only really leaves us the early bumblebee as an option. And what about this one? Who thinks that this might be an early bumblebee? Very pensive faces. No one willing to commit. Oh, one. Who thinks that this might be a red-tailed bumblebee? No one. And who thinks that this might be a bilberry bumblebee? No one. Yeah, this is an early bumblebee, but it's a worker. So you can see it's got pollen in the pollen baskets, which tells you it's either going to be a worker or a queen, because males don't collect pollen. We've got a yellow band behind the head here. We've got a little orangey red tail. That's clearly not white, but it's not proper bright red either. I mentioned workers often lose this abdominal band. We've got enough here to say that this is going to be a worker early bumblebee. Now, I think this is our penultimate one. Who thinks that this might be a bilberry bumblebee? Few hands going up there. Who thinks that this might be an early bumblebee? Few hands, but I think a few going down. And who thinks that this might be a red-tailed bumblebee? One extra hand going up. Well, that hand is correct, because this is a male red-tailed bumblebee. So in this case, it's not the greatest angle, but that leg doesn't really look much like a pollen basket. It's got a bit of hair on the face there. And we can also see that it's got a big yellow moustache. So the hair on the actual front of the face is yellow here. And straight away, that takes us down to the bilberry bumblebee, the red-tailed bumblebee, or the early bumblebee. Now, the early bumblebee is much more yellow. It would have a big yellow band on the abdomen here, as well as more yellow either end of the thorax, so we can rule that one out. The bilberry bumblebee would have a much bigger red tail. Red will come up to about here or so that tail isn't big enough. But what it is perfect for is the red-tailed bumblebee male. And so they spend a lot of time like this, sitting on knapweed, not doing very much. So this is probably the classic location and appearance for a red-tailed bumblebee male. And this, I think, is our last one before we get cracking on the whitetails. Who thinks that this might be a moss carder, Bombus muscorum? Or two new hands going up. Who thinks that this might be a common carder bumblebee? Two new hands going up. And I won't insult your intelligence by giving you any other option there. It's clearly one of the ginger species. This is in fact male common carder. So in this case, we can see it does have some little black hairs on here. It's not particularly obvious, extensive black areas, but we can, again, looking across, we can see that there are decent numbers of black hairs in there. And unfortunately, you do need to look at that kind of level to be able to split them when they're like this. Form agricola is much easier than the common form of muscorum, but you do need to look quite closely. In this case, it's got these slightly creamier sides. They're not the bright yellow. We don't have the bright yellow abdomen that I'd expect to see from muscorum. So straight away, we should be thinking pastorum because it's got this unicolor sort of gingery brown sort of color. And then we can confirm that with these black hairs that you can see on the abdomen. You might need to squint a bit depending on how big your screen is. And in the field, you would probably need to use a hand lens. Oh no, we've got one more. Who thinks that this might be the red-tailed bumblebee? One. Who thinks that this might be the bilberry bumblebee? Loads of hands going on. That's good. Because this is a queen bilberry bumblebee. So yeah, you can see really big, bright orange tail extending most of the way up the abdomen here. Thorax has got yellow bands front and back quite clearly. This is nectaring on a willow. That's quite common in queen bilberry bumblebees in early spring before the heather's out. And so this is, again, a fairly classic sort of location and appearance for the bilberry bumblebee queen before they go out onto the open moorland. So moving back into the ID side of things in the last half hour, the white-tailed bumblebees are the largest group, so we break them down into subgroups to make life a little bit easier. So these are the white-tailed bumblebees, which have got 2 yellow bands on them. And there are a couple of common and a couple of scarce species. Nationally, the commonest species in the country is the buff-tailed bumblebee, Bombus terrestris. It reaches its northern range extent within the project area, but it is colonising and becoming increasingly abundant. Even 10 or so years ago, Katie and I ran a training course on the seafront at Wick, and this was the most abundant species that we found, much to our surprise. So it's been in the Inner Hebrides and the Argyll for quite a long while down here. It colonised Shetland, Orkney, and the North Coast, all within the same decade, 2010s or so. More recently, it's turned up in the Outer Hebrides. You can see after this map was created, actually. So it's a species which is becoming much more common in the area and is a species which you are likely to come across a lot more frequently over the next few years than you might have done in the past. Queens are nice and straightforward. Queen buff-tailed bumblebees have a buff-coloured tail. Buff is one of those entomologist words that isn't really used anywhere else, and it's this sort of yellowy brown colour. It's not quite as bright as orange, but it's not white either. It's this sort of yellowy brown intermediate. And queens are really, really big, quite hefty things. They're just starting to fly now in the south. I'm not sure if they're out yet in Scotland. Workers and males make life a little bit trickier because they have white tails. And sometimes they have what we call the T-stain, this very faint, thin sort of yellow-brown band between the black of the abdomen and the white of the tail. If they've got that, and if it's definitely that and not shadow or pollen or whatever, then they will be the buff tail. But often they're very, very hard, impossible in many cases, to split from workers of the white-tailed bumblebee group, which I'll talk about shortly. But they do generally have these slightly darker bands and generally are slightly bigger and heftier. And yeah, coming soon to a garden near you if they continue their current rate of increase. The white-tailed bumblebee, Sensulatu, is really widespread all over the project area, apart from Shetland, where there's just one record. But Orkney, the North Coast, the Inner Hebrides, the Outer Hebrides, they're all over the place in good numbers. Queens, workers, and males always have a completely bright white tail. They never have any yellow hairs in it. So if you've got a 2-banded white-tailed bumblebee with a pure white tail, it's more likely to be this than anything else. And if it's big and it's the size of a queen, it's very likely to be a white-tailed bumblebee because you don't really get very big workers of terrestris. Males are also relatively straightforward to tell apart because not only do they have this pure white tail, but they also are quite extensively yellow. And in particular, they have this big, bright yellow face. You can see the moustache here. That's never present in males with buff tail. Male buff tails always have a black face. So you're looking for an absence of yellow at the back end and the presence of yellow in the moustache in the males. The confusing factor, slightly, is that what we call the white-tailed bumblebee is actually 3 species. So we didn't realise this until 40 or so years ago, but actually we do have 3 species. We have the true Bombus licorum, but we also have the northern white-tailed bumblebee, Bombus magnus, and the cryptic white-tailed bumblebee, Bombus cryptarum, and all 3 of them are found in good numbers all over Scotland, basically. Cryptarum and magnus quite like upland areas, heathland, moorland. Licorum is quite happy in that sort of environment, but is also found down into the lowlands as well. And unfortunately, this is from a 2012 paper, which finds actually all the morphological features that we had been using up until that point. So theoretically, Cryptarum is supposed to have this S-shaped break, little black-haired break in the collar band. Licorum is supposed to have this short collar band, which doesn't extend below the wing bases. And Magnus is supposed to be quite extensively yellow, with big yellow collar band extending backwards underneath the wing. Unfortunately, what that paper found is that none of those external ID features work, basically. So there is no way currently to reliably split those 3 species in the field, because you can see morphologically this column was all supposed to be Cryptarum, this was supposed to all be Licorum, this was supposed to all be Magnus. When you look at the DNA, then we had complete cross-match. So those ID features just don't work. We lump them all back together as the white-tailed bumblebee. So if you've got 2 yellow bands and a pure white tail, it's going to be one of those 3 species, but we lump them all together as the Bombus licorum sensu-latu, the old form of that name. So moving quickly on from those, because they're a little bit horrible. They don't interbreed, no, they're good species. They do have very slightly different foraging niches and that kind of thing. A friend of mine spent a lot of time in Glencoe watching them all doing very slightly different things and recording them. They don't interbreed. They have different mating pheromones. That's one of the first ways that we found they were different, actually. So they are good species. They're just very, very similar in appearance. So the other species that you can sometimes come across and sometimes looks quite similar is the broken-belted bumblebee, Bombus sarawensis. It's absent from the Outer Hebrides, it's absent from Shetland. There is 1 record on Orkney, which is almost certainly an individual that got blown there, a vagrant. And it is around on the north coast and in the Inner Hebrides and Argyll. This is generally a species of similar habitat to the bilberry bumblebee. You can see it quite likes these upland areas. It's a moorland, heathland species. Certainly in Scotland, it has some slightly different habitat preferences in England and Wales, but generally this is a species of upland areas. It looks very similar to the white-tailed bumblebee. It's got this pure white tail in the queens and the workers, you can see here, and then these 2 yellow bands, yellow collar band, yellow band on the abdomen. Males often make life easy because they not only have this big sort of extent of peachy fuzz in the tail quite often, but the collar band extends all the way around. So they have what looks like a great big sort of yellow mane, like little lions. But they only come out very late in the season. You don't start seeing those until September, and they'll start flying into October. Queens come out in June, and obviously workers are what you're mostly likely to see. And they get a little bit more difficult to identify. Generally, they look a little bit brighter and a little bit fluffier than equivalent-sized whitetails. But the key identifying feature is that the yellow band on the abdomen, it fades out slightly in the middle, but the key thing is that it sweeps forward at the sides. So it extends forward onto this first abdominal section on the sides. So you almost have this bow tie shaped band with thinner in the middle and much wider at the edges. In the buff-tailed bumblebee and the white-tailed bumblebee, that band is just rectangular all the way across. It's just this rectangle of yellow laid across the bee. In this species, it's much more irregular with sort of crescent-shaped front, narrowing in the middle. But the key thing is that it comes forward at the sides, because all of the species with that yellow band on the abdomen As they get older, they wear away hairs in the middle at the top here. So they all get a little bit of a break in this band in the middle. So the key thing is that there's got yellow hairs forward onto that first abdominal section at the sides. And this is a very late flying species. Even in the south of England, the queens don't come out of hibernation until June. And as I say, they'll fly really quite late in big numbers to the end of September and even into October. So if you're up in moorland areas in particular, this is a species to look out for from sort of July, August sort of time onwards. And that leaves us with a couple of cuckoo bumblebees, which fit into this group. The first of these is the gypsy cuckoo, Bombus bohemicus. This is parasitic on the white-tailed bumblebee, and it looks relatively similar. You can see it's got a white tail, it's got a yellow collar band, it tends to have a little bit of yellow in the middle, which varies in extent between individuals. It's generally a little bit more extensive in the male, as you can see up here, than it is in the female. But the really key thing for this species is that we've got these yellow sort of saddlebags, these little flashes on the sides of the front of the tail. So we've got a white tail, and then in the sides, we've got these little yellow patches, both in the queens and in the males. The extent of them, the exact coloration of them does vary a little bit, but they're always there and you can always see them. And there's only one other species, and that doesn't come any further north than Edinburgh, Bombus bostalis. So in your area, if you see something with these little yellow tail flashes, it has to be this species. There are no records of it from Shetland, but it is found on Orkney, on the north coast, the Inner Hebrides and the Outer Hebrides. Not very many in the Outer Hebrides. You can see there aren't any recent records, but there are records up there, just not particularly recent. And because it's parasitic on the white-tailed bumblebee, the white-tail is up there in good numbers, so this is likely to be lurking up there somewhere. Yeah, you're looking for that yellow midriff band and these yellow tail flashes that arrow has drifted slightly from where it ought to be. And it's quite a shaggy looking species, generally speaking. Our next group, I think our penultimate group actually, are the white-tailed bumblebees, which have got 3 or more yellow bands. And there aren't very many of these, luckily. The commonest, by far the most common bumblebee that you're likely to see with this colour pattern is the garden bumblebee. As you can see, it's on Shetland, it's on the Orkneys, it's on the north coast, the Inner Hebrides, Outer Hebrides, all of them in pretty good numbers. It's quite a decent size, quite a chunky species, and it looks quite yellow when you come across it, because it not only has this yellow collar band and this yellow abdominal band, but it also has this extra yellow band at the back of the thorax. And when it's in flight, or when it's got its wings open, this just looks like a big, thick block of yellow across the middle part of the bee. This is a really long-tongued species, so this is the species that you'll quite often see feeding on things like Montbretia and nasturtium and foxgloves, in a way that the short-tongued species just can't reach the pollen and nectar in those flowers, so they don't visit. Queens, males and workers all look very, very similar, but queens are a little bit bigger, workers are a little bit smaller, and generally pure white tail, really quite distinct appearance. It's a nice straightforward one. It always has a black face, it always has black hairs on the legs. It sometimes produces these melanic or at least semi-melanic forms. Melanic basically means blacker than normal. It's got an increased amount of melanin, a black pigment produced. But even there, you can see that it's still got yellow where it ought to, just not quite as much of it. And generally, you won't see any that look like this. It's a fairly occasional variant, and you're looking for 3 yellow bands, yellow collar band, yellow back of the thorax band, yellow front of the abdomen, and then this white tail with a long face and a long tongue. And that's important because the other species which looks quite similar is the heath bumblebee, Bombus genellus, and this is a slightly smaller species, much more of a moorland, heathland sort of species. It likes acid areas in particular. And although it's got very similar basic pattern to the garden bumblebee, it's got yellow front and back on the thorax, plus the front of the abdomen, plus a white tail. It's smaller, it's fluffier. Females, particularly queens, usually have these orange hairs on the legs. You can see around the pollen baskets here, but also on the middle leg here. It's got these sort of orangey fringing hairs, peach colour. And males have yellow hairs on the face. So you can see this decent sized yellow moustache there. So, and it's got a little round face with a short tongue. So you won't ever see it feeding on long tubular flowers, things like foxgloves or nasturtium or whatever. It likes shorter flowers, things like heather in particular, it really, really enjoys. And if you are lucky enough to be on Shetland or the Outer Hebrides, there's also a slightly different colour form hebridensis on the Hebrides, form vogtii on Shetland. It's basically the same colour form, they've got slightly different names, but the outside appearance is very, very similar. And the key thing is that the tail isn't white in that colour form. We get this yellowy buff coloured back end, as you can see here. This is a fairly extreme example. This is the queen. Workers often, and males, only have a little bit of a hint of coloration in there, but it's clearly not just white. It can look quite similar to the broken-belted bumblebee, Bombus thorarensis, but much more yellow in the middle, in particular yellow at the back of the thorax for that species. And it generally has, in these colour forms, more yellow in the middle. So this abdominal band in particular, in the typical form, the mainland form, it's only the first abdominal section that's got yellow. In this species, subspecies or form, it's got at least sort of 2 sections covered in these bright yellow hairs. So it's a much more extensively yellow species. It's got this orangey yellow back end as well. It's a really, really distinctive colour form when you do see it. Otherwise, it's very similar, lives in the same kind of places as the normal colour form. So splitting the 3-banded whitetails can be a bit tricky. Luckily, you can ignore Rideratus completely. As you can see from the map, it's not found for several hundred miles away from where the project area is. But you do have both the garden bumblebee, Bombus filtorum, and the heath bumblebee, Bombus genellus. They're both of them pretty widespread in the project area. Filtorum is bigger and neater. Genellus is small and scruffy looking. And the key thing really is that face length. So Genellus over here has this little round face, Charlie Brown type face, which is about as long as it is wide. If you overlay a circle on that, you can see it's almost identical length and width. If you overlay that same circle on Bombus filtorum, the garden bumblebee, you can see it's got a face which is much longer than it is wide. So it's noticeably long-faced, long-tongued species, feeds on that slightly different range of flowers, generally speaking, but you'll get your eye in for them relatively quickly, but you do need to certainly pay attention with the first few that you see. And the only other species in this group is Barbott's cuckoo, which is parasitic on the garden bumblebee. In the project area, it's only found on Orkney. There are a few recent records actually creeping up into the Hebrides. I couldn't find any definitive source on those, but it's worth looking out for if you're in that sort of area. It looks quite similar to the garden bumblebee, never has anywhere near as much yellow hair on the abdomen, but has a pure white tail, doesn't have those yellow saddlebags that we saw with the other cuckoo, Bombus bohemicus. Got these lovely dark wings that you can see here, hairy hind legs in both queens and males. And you can see it's quite sparsely haired. It's got the exoskeleton shining through here. So you can tell that it's a cuckoo using those standard sort of group features. And then haven't got the saddlebags. It's got very little yellow on the abdomen here, so it stands out from the other potential cuckoo species as well. And it's a species which may well be moving north. It's probably climate limited up here, but it's not doing it very fast. So yeah, you're looking for those dark wings, that yellow at the back of the thorax, and then this big yellow band at the front. And that leaves us with one species. We've got our last 15 minutes or so. This is the white-tailed bumblebee with a ginger thorax, a tree bumblebee. It's not quite up into the project area yet, but it is moving northwards through Scotland at quite a pace. And so it's quite likely that it will turn up if we have a decent summer this year. It's probably the single most distinctive bumblebee that we have in Britain. It's actually a fairly new arrival. It turned up new on the south coast, down just outside Southampton in 2001. And so you can see it spread amazingly quickly up through the country. I always think of it having a sort of Neapolitan ice cream appearance to it. It's just got these three lumps of colour. It's just got this nice ginger brown thorax, then black abdomen, and then a pure white tail. There's no fussy little bands or anything like that. It's just got these three lumps of colour, one after the other, and there is nothing else like it. The only thing that you could really mistake it for is a worn example of Bombus pastorum, the common carder, but even that is not particularly close in appearance. It never has a white tail, and tree bumblebee always has these black sides to the thorax. They're never cream or yellow as they are in the carders. So it's a really distinctive species in general. Well worth looking out for if you are on the mainland. It crossed over into Northern Ireland, so it can do sea crossings. It is spreading northwards. I'd be quite surprised if it's not found somewhere, at least north of where it currently lives in this coming year. It does produce these melanic individuals fairly frequently. It's probably the most frequent species to produce melanic individuals that I've come across. But even there, it only does half a job. You can see it's got a lot more melanin, a lot darker hair on the thorax than you expect to have, but it's still got ginger in there. It's still got these ginger fringes in particular, and it's still got this pure white tail. Plus, generally, if you see one that looks like this, it tends to be hanging around with a whole load that looks like this as well. And it really likes soft fruit. It feeds on raspberries and that kind of thing. Bramble, it really enjoys as well. And you do get a lot of them in quite close proximity generally. So that's all of the species that we're going to cover. So we've got a little bit more in terms of field kit. So you can get a really long way looking for bumblebees without any kind of kit at all. But some of those ID features, particularly for the more difficult species, are quite small. And particularly if you're looking at the Colletes, then you need to have quite a close look. So having a net to catch it with, anything that's sold as a butterfly net will be fine, basically. And a hand lens to have a closer look at some of those sections, looking for things like that punctuation. I generally recommend 10 times hand lens. You can get more powerful ones, but it's a balance between being able to get the right bit in focus, having that depth of field to let you see what you're looking at, and the magnification. And 10 times I find is that sweet spot, really. There's enough chance that you've got enough depth of field to get the right bit in focus for long enough to be able to see what you need to see, and enough magnification to be able to see it. Having a pot to put it in is also quite useful because bees can sting. So just a normal sample tube is generally fine, but the bee is obviously buzzing around in there. If you need to see finer details or a certain bit of it, it's quite difficult to get it held in the right place. And so what we also recommend are these queen marker cages or queen marker pots, which are invented by beekeepers in order to put the queen in so they can dab a bit of paint on so they can see her a little bit more easily in the colony. But they're also really good for identifying wild bees. And so the way that it works is that you have this little wood and sponge plunger, an open perspex tube, and then a grid across the end. So you put your bee in here like this, and then you can adjust how much space it has to buzz around in with the plunger. So you can just gently hold it up against the end or the side of the pot so that you can hold it in place and get a decent look at the right bit. And that means that you need to have it in captivity for a much shorter period of time. The grid means there's a bit of airflow. It's not going to overheat quite as quickly as it might in these pots. And it just means it's quicker and easier for both for you and for the bee. And to answer one of the questions in the chat, there are an awful lot of ID guides out there now, which is astonishing, really. 15 or so years ago, when I started getting interested properly in bees, there weren't really any. And now suddenly we're overrun with the things. So BBCT have produced our ID guide, this one up here, Bumblebees, an introduction, by Nikki, myself, and a couple of others. This basically distilled all of our experience from delivering all of these kind of training courses and seeing where people were going wrong and struggling and that kind of thing. So there's about 4 pages on each species. You've got pictures of all the different colour forms and casts. You've got big arrows saying this is the key bit and that kind of thing, distribution maps and habitats and lots of useful information. So that one obviously is our main recommendation. But last year, in fact 2 years ago now, Richard Lewington produced this pocket guide, which is also really good. We advised on the text and that kind of thing, so it's all solid, and it is slightly more pocket sized than any of the others here. And I still really like this one. This is much more of a key-based approach, but it's a nice, simple, straightforward key, and there's a lot of good background information in that book as well. So this Naturalist Handbook to Bumblebees. So Naturalist Handbooks in general are a really good series, and I can thoroughly recommend the Ladybird one as well if you're interested, because I wrote it. If you're interested in the solitary bees beyond bumblebees, then Steve Falk, Richard Lewington again, produced this book 10 years ago now, horrifyingly, and it's really the only game in town if you want to look at the solitary bees. Be aware that it's not really a field guide for the solitaries, because most of them are really difficult to ID. You can imagine if you've got a 5mm bee and you're having to look at the size of the punctures on one particular section, you need it under a microscope. So there are many of them that you just can't do in the field, but you can do them with that book. And I also include this one, again, because I wrote it. It's a hopefully really nice introduction to bumblebees. It's a natural history book rather than an ID guide, but that background on how bumblebees came to be, what are they actually doing, foraging, that kind of thing, that's all covered in there, slightly more than it is in these ID-focused guides. And in our last couple of minutes, we've got a quick quiz again on any of the bumblebees that we've just covered. So who thinks that this might be a buff-tailed bumblebee? No virtual hands going up, possibly a real hand. Who thinks that this might be a white-tailed bumblebee? Hands going up there, yeah. Who thinks that this might be a broken-belted bumblebee, Bombus sorrowensis? Two hands going up, two hands going down. This is a white-tailed bumblebee. If it were a worker, it could have been a buff-tail as well, because that would have a white tail, but this was actually quite a big one. It was a queen, so we would be happy to say this was a white-tailed bumblebee. It's not a broken-belted bumblebee. You can't see the break in the middle underneath the wings, but what you can see is that this is just clearly a rectangular band on that second abdominal section. There's no hint of yellow coming forward into here, onto the sides of that first abdominal section. It would always be doing that if it were a broken-belted bumblebee, so this isn't a broken-belted bumblebee, this is a white-tailed. What about this one? Who thinks that this might be a broken-belted bumblebee? And who thinks that this might be a white-tailed bumblebee? New hand. And who thinks that this might be a buff-tailed bumblebee? Lots of hands. That's good, because this is indeed a buff-tailed bumblebee. This is a queen, and you can see that she's got this quite obviously buff coloured tail. It's clearly not that pure white tail that we just saw in the white-tailed queen. It's clearly got a different colour going on there than this is a buff-tailed bumblebee. What about this one? Who thinks that this might be a broken-belted bumblebee? Quite a lot of hands. Who thinks that this might be the worker of either a buff-tail or a white-tail, given that you can't really tell them apart? A few hands coming down, a few different ones going up. This is that buff-tail / white-tailed worker. So that's what I was talking about when I said that all of the bumblebees with this abdominal band often lose hairs in the middle through wear. It's where the wings rub, it's where they bump into vegetation going in and out of the nest, in and out of flowers. So particularly once you get older individuals, they all show this broken belt in the middle there. So this isn't black hairs, which it would be if it were a broken belted bumblebee. It's just a loss of hairs. And although it's very difficult to tell that from this kind of photo or from a bee flying around, what you can see again is that the yellow band is not coming forward at the side. This yellow band is just a rectangular strip on this second abdominal section. It's not coming forward at the sides. It's not that bow tie shape. It's just got some wear in the middle of this rectangular band here. What about this one? Who thinks that this might be a broken belted bumblebee? Hands going up. Who thinks that this might be a heath bumblebee, Bombus genellus? Hands going up. Going down again. Who thinks that this might be a garden bumblebee, Bombus hortorum? Loads of hands going up. That's good because this is a garden bumblebee. So we've got a white tail here. We've got 1, 2, 3 yellow bands here. And this picture, I gave you a nice face on shot. This has clearly got a face which is much longer than it is wide. You could probably also tell this, to be honest, from just this picture, because it's feeding on this long tubular flowers. You can see it's got up below the eye here, it's got this quite long expansive cheek, so that's probably going to be a long-tongued bumblebee. And long-tongued, 3 bands, white tail, has to be the garden bumblebee. What about this one? Who thinks that this might be a buff-tailed bumblebee? Few hands going up. A lot of hands going up. Who thinks that this might be a white-tailed bumblebee? Few hands. Who thinks that this might be a broken-belted bumblebee? I've had one sometime, right? Yeah, this is a male buff-tailed bumblebee. So you can see it's got a hairy hind leg here. So straight away that has to be either a male or a cuckoo bumblebee. We've got that tea stain that I mentioned all the way around. It's not a little saddlebag just down here, so it won't be that cuckoo. We've got a black face, so it's not going to be the male white-tailed bumblebee, which always has that big yellow moustache. So this is a male buff-tailed bumblebee. That's our penultimate example. We've got one left, which is good because we've got 2 minutes of our time left. Who thinks that this might be a common carder bumblebee? Anyone willing to be drawn? Who would actually like a closer look, or for it to move around and show us some different angles? Lots of people. That's good, because if it turns round, it's a fly. It's clearly not a bumblebee. This is a hoverfly, which is a reasonable mimic of Bombus pascorum. And I always leave this in at the end because it's really easy to just get stuck in a rut. You're going out, you're looking for bumblebees, you have seen this flying buzzy fuzzy thing, therefore it must be a bumblebee. But actually, there are a lot of things out there which are deliberately trying to mislead you in many cases. And if you aren't quite sure, if you're looking at something and it just doesn't quite fit, it's always worth just going back to first principles, just going back, is it actually a bumblebee? Looking at its head, you can see this head is almost entirely made up of eye. We've got these funny little stumpy antennae. That's clearly a fly head and not a bumblebee head. It does look noticeably different once you actually are receptive to what you're seeing. But it's very easy just to get stuck in that rut of, why doesn't this fit any of the bumblebees in my field guide, without taking the next step, but because it's not a bumblebee. So it's now 12, so if people want to go, they can, but there's also a little bit of time for questions, should there be any. And there's one in the chat that I haven't answered yet, which is, are there any cuckoos for tree bumblebees that might be following? On the continent, there is. Bombus, I think, forestieri, I need to double check that. At the moment, there are no British records of that species, so it doesn't seem to have crossed the channel with Hypnorum, and that release from Natural Enemies is one of the reasons why, possible reasons why it might be doing so well, but it's not here yet. I will also just flag up before I forget that Callum and Katie will be sending around an evaluation form after this, so please do fill that in and say how good it was. I'm probably not supposed to say that, but yeah, do fill in the evaluation form when that comes round. And otherwise, if there are any more questions, then either stick them in the chat or pipe up now. I think
I
the
have a
video will be
question.
coming round. Go on.
If I'm doing a bee walk and I see a bumblebee that's clearly a carder bee, but I'm not sure which one it is, would you prefer me to put it as common carder or as an unknown bumblebee?
In that sort of situation where you can narrow it down, put it down as unknown bumblebee, but put a comment in the field as to what you've narrowed it down to. So if it's a cuckoo or it's one of the carders or one of the red tails or whatever, just put that in the comments field.
Thank you.
So I believe the video will be circulated. We can probably also circulate the slides as well. I think we did last year. So that will all go round from Callum and Katie in the next couple of days. Unless there are any more burning questions, then we'll call it a day and go to lunch, I think.